So if you ask me, have we managed to change the word of law? No. But have we been able to influence the spirit of laws? Yes, we have.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Ever since the fall of Kabul to the Taliban 3 years ago, I've periodically checked in with my guest today, Zuhra Bahman. She is the Afghanistan Country Director for Search for Common Ground, an NGO that works on peacebuilding. When the Taliban toppled the Afghan government and asserted control of Kabul, Zuhra Bahman just happened to be out of the country on a business trip. But she was determined to return, and she did. As she explained in our previous conversations, she felt an obligation to influence the direction of her country under Taliban rule, and in so doing, improve the lives of women and girls in the country, and continue her work to promote peacebuilding efforts. In our conversation today, I ask, has she been successful? Has there been any meaningful advances for women and girls under the Taliban rule? And how, as an Afghan female civil society leader, is she able to operate and continue to do her job? Zuhra Bahman's perspective on engaging the Taliban to achieve tangible benefits for women and girls and the Afghan people in general is not something you often hear in the Western media, but I think it's important for you to learn directly from an Afghan civil society leader what life is like under the Taliban and how engaging with the Taliban actually works. I really appreciate Zuhra Bahman speaking to me once again from Kabul. This is probably the third or fourth time we've spoken over the last 3 years, and I really appreciate the perspective she gives on one of the more vexing questions in international affairs today, whether or how to engage the Taliban. So here it is, my conversation with Zuhra Bahman, Afghanistan Country Director for Search for Common Ground. Zuhra, thank you so much for joining me again. We've spoken a few times over the years. I believe this is our fourth conversation for the podcast. Now, the first time we spoke was just a few weeks after Kabul fell to the Taliban in 2021. You happened to be out of the country on a business trip, yet at the time you told me you were determined to return. Can you describe your thinking and motivations for coming back to Afghanistan when you could have stayed abroad?
It's great to be with you again and talk and share my thoughts and experiences. And yes, I distinctly remember our first conversation. And at the time, of course, there was a lot of uncertainty. Didn't know what was going to happen, especially for a woman who's a professional who has been working around peacebuilding. But I'm glad that I stayed. I think it's one of the best decisions I've made in my life. My heart still skips a beat every time I return to Kabul from a travel. And every time the plane lands into Kabul, where you're in a valley and you enter Kabul, and in front of you there's the flat plains of Kabul where the metropolis is viewable. Every time I see that, I get a feel of gratitude and that I decided to stay and to be here, to be of service to people around me and to myself and do the best I can. At that time, I didn't know what the situation was going to be like. But I'm thankful that I not only stayed to see the situation as it unfolded, but also to influence it, to try and steer the course of what was going on in my country and for myself and my peers.
So the idea, I take it, of course, you express this like profound love for Kabul, for Afghanistan, which I can sense from having talked to you so many times over the years. But really, it sounds like one of your motivations was to see if you could impact decisions that were being made by the new de facto authorities, the Taliban. Have you been able to meaningfully sway some of their decision makings in any kind of discernible way? Or are you like summarily dismissed for being a woman and a head of a foreign NGO, so called?
The first hurdle for me, and I think for many of us, was to rethink the way the Taliban were conceptualized, individuals as a movement, and the way the republic was conceptualized, the civil society was conceptualized for the last 20 years. In that narrative, we were always situated against each other. And on both sides, or on all sides, the narrative relied on othering the opposition. So for the Taliban, women that worked in NGOs and foreign NGOs, or with the foreign backed republic, were the other, were the non Afghans, were not to be trusted. And for the people and women who worked within NGOs, within the government, the Taliban were other. They are not Afghans. They don't have the same values as us. They don't feel the same as us about the country, about progress. So the first few interactions were, of course, fear, mistrust. But then I firmly believe that the Taliban have always been a part of this country. I don't believe they are other. I do not believe they come from outside. They are, as a movement, part of this country. They're born out of the history of this country and they belong to this country. And when you accept that, then that love and that patriotism and that desire to bring about positive change for your community extends to them. One example of my early interaction with the Taliban, it was the first Ramadan after the fall of Republic, and I went to an iftar dinner and I was hosting it, and there were many, many people, probably around 70, 60 people. And I could see that there was a young man who was the only man that I could see clearly as being part of the Taliban. So I went to him and I greeted him like I was greeting everybody else. He murmured and he wasn't really looking up, he wasn't talking to me. And I went away next day. The organization who had brought him over called me and he said, "Look, this young man sends his apologies. And he says that you are the first ever woman that has spoken to him who's outside his immediate family." He wasn't sure how to speak.
Huh.
I sent a message back saying, "Well, I'm glad that he talked to me. Would he like to have another conversation? Because I would like to talk to him as the first woman he's spoken to." And this young man is maybe about 20, 21. So he came and he met me one day and I said, "What do you like to do?" He asked me, "What did I do?" And I told him I used to teach at the university. And he said, "What advice would I give him as a young man?" And I said, "My advice to you is to get an education. Have you finished school?" And he said, "Yes." In Pakistani refugee camps, he had finished school. "So what do you want to do?" He said he wants to work, to be a government employee, a civil servant. And I said, "Well, look, you can be a civil servant with, a school certificate, but what do you think about getting an actual university education? Because everybody is looking at you from outside. The emirate is actually under a lot of scrutiny. So putting even a very intelligent 12th grader into the government is not a very good idea. Maybe you should go to university." About maybe around a year after that, he came to our door in the office and he knocked and he said he wants to meet me again. And of course, I said, "Okay, sure, come and meet me." And he came in again and he said he's just finished his second semester at university and he's studying IT. And I said, "Well, that's nice." And he said he's here to tell me this news, but he's also here to tell me he'd like to invite me over to meet his sister. And he wants me to see his mother. And I thought, you know, there's a barrier that's broken. And for a lot of people like myself and those of us that live inside Afghanistan, there's a lot of interactions like this. My colleague who was driving to his volleyball practice one day and he picks up a Taliban member and they strike a conversation about girls' education. And if you look at stereotypes, they're the wrong ethnic groups to each other. They're the wrong religion. They're the wrong, socioeconomic education background to each other. But by the time the guy needs to be dropped off, my colleague invites him to join his basketball practice, and he joins in, and he joins in again the next week. So these human interactions are changing things.
Can I just ask though, like just on this question of human interactions? I mean, they're changing things in the anecdotes that you shared, but are they happening like at scale to your knowledge?
If you expect for the Taliban government to change some of their major policies upon which they fought for the last 20 years, no. But if you see some of the flexibility that at subnational level that have been negotiated, then I would say yes. For example, if you pick the issue of women's work, around women's work, of course, there is an overall ban on women's work in NGOs. However, the ban has exceptions, and there is space around those exceptions, which is increasingly expanding.
Presumably you work in that sort of gray zone of an exception.
Yes, absolutely. So if you ask me, have we managed to change the word of law? No. But have we been able to influence the spirit of laws? Yes, we have. And I believe that drastic change in short term is not acceptable, but also not ideal. In Afghanistan's history, whenever a drastic change has been pushed by anyone into any direction and for whatever cause, it has not succeeded. I think we need to be able to see these small victories and make sure that we repeat the actions that lead to these small victories.
On that question of like small victories, from your time 3 years ago to today, has your ability to operate and frankly like live as a female leader of an NGO in Kabul, have you had like more opportunities since the start of the de facto rule, or has it been receded? Has it been about the same? Is like that gray zone that you described earlier, is it expanding, contracting? Like what has been the trend, you'd say?
In the Republic time, 30% of workforce working in the aid sector in NGOs, local and international, and UN included, were women. Today, credible surveys conducted by the UN shows that it is still 30% of women that are working in these sectors. Modalities may be different. A lot of women compared to last year are falling within that zone of permissible work for women. So they are working from their offices in the field. Women are working remotely. Women are working in many, many different ways. So if you look at it that way, then perhaps it's better than the December when everybody had to halt working.
You're referring to December 2021, like a few months after Kabul fell and the Taliban issued an edict banning women's work.
Yes. So if you compare to a blanket ban on women's work, then it is not there. There's a lot of space to maneuver. But then there are not only about what the de facto authorities are saying and doing, but it is not us versus them. It is more of a situation where there are many stakeholders at play. For example, the international community itself. We are seeing a drastic reduction in the aid that's coming into Afghanistan. I work with a large group of Afghan women who are capable, who are leading organizations here in the fields of health, for example, in livelihoods, in nutrition, private enterprise, that these women have no access to funding, even compared to the first year of the fall of the Republic. A lot of the money that comes into Afghanistan, very little of it goes to women led organizations. It goes to mainly large entities with large overheads, and Afghan women who have carved themselves space to be effective don't get a lot of money. And we need to change that. So we don't live in this isolation where there is Afghan women only dealing with or reacting to the edicts that the authorities are putting in place. But we are sitting in a situation where we are also having to deal with the reduced or conditionalized support of the international community to us and to our organizations.
The UN and many parts of the international community, they've tried to find a kind of modus vivendi with the Taliban so that they can serve the people of Afghanistan, but not in reality or in perception, do so in a way that ostensibly props up the Taliban. Like, is that even possible, though? I mean, it sounds like you're able to do it at like a local level, but in terms of how the international community engages with Afghanistan, can they do foreign aid in a way that serves the people of Afghanistan, but without propping up the de facto authorities?
Well, first of all, let's see, how do people define propping up the local authorities? Right now, I'm talking to you sitting in a room with the electricity on. It's evening in Kabul. This electricity is a government electricity. So when I pay my electricity bill, am I paying into the Taliban, supporting it as a social political movement, or am I paying for a service that is being delivered to me? So is this the definition of propping up the Taliban? Then no, the international community cannot do that. Or I pay my taxes on my salary to the Taliban. But then the Taliban also provide me with healthcare. Recently, I had a ear operation and I went to the government hospital for my checkups. That's where my tax money goes. This weekend, I visited another part of Kabul that I don't go to often, and a new road was ready for our use. My taxes are going to that as well. So, in that sense, yes. But also, we have to really fact check the way the money comes into Afghanistan. It comes through mostly the United Nations and big international organizations. We have checks and balances. We go through very thorough system of analysis of our proposals, our reports, our audits, and so on. So let's not count that money as supporting the Taliban as a movement. But then if we move to the political kind of engagement, because we have to also depoliticize aid, because even within your question, I feel like you are talking at one hand around the international aid to Afghanistan, which should not be politicized. But then on the other hand, you are talking about the international engagement with the Taliban as a government by other political entities which are governing other countries. Now, let's talk about the second part. The second part is, I think that the international community could do a lot more in enhancing their engagement with the Taliban. Right now, the engagement that happens with the Taliban is mainly concentrated around one off meetings, very politicized meetings, very short meetings, meetings that happen in a vacuum. They are not prepared for, no trust building takes place beforehand, and there are no follow ups. It's usually talking at the Taliban. What I think we should do as the international community is to make the interaction, the engagement with the Taliban, something lengthy, something boring, something continuous and long term and administrative. So I think we need to have a lot of processes and a lot of conversations inside Afghanistan. And to do that, we need not whirlwind visits to Kabul, but people based in Kabul that continuously talk and understand and then seek to influence, and influence could be both ways.
And can you do that? Can foreign entities do that? Foreign governments or even the UN do that without formally recognizing the de facto authorities as the head of Afghanistan? Or does it require some sort of like formal recognition?
Recognition of a government is a very complicated process, and having a diplomatic mission does not necessarily mean that that country's government is recognized or not. I mean, at the moment, we can see that right now in Afghanistan, we have the European Union mission here. Does European Union and its individual members recognize the Taliban as the government? I don't think so. Having a consistent presence in the country does not change anything for worse. But what it does is it shows moral courage, it shows commitment towards engaging with a regime who impacts the life of 40 million people. And it encourages conversations and it encourages finding ways to resolve problems that are not only Afghanistan's problems or international problems, it's all of our moral problems. For example, hunger, for example, environment, for example, girls' education. So that interaction needs to happen not at the world stage in a conference, but it has to happen consistently in the country. The other thing is about the role of the UN. At the moment in Afghanistan, the UN is becoming really hard to understand. UN is on one hand seen as the political representative of rest of the world in Afghanistan. They talk about social, political issues. They keep an eye on the situation in the country. And of course, part of it is the UN's remit, but it is not the UN's remit to represent the rest of the world or its member states and their individual political interests, while at the same time providing humanitarian aid, development aid, which is supposed to be separate from the political side of the organization. If more countries ensure diplomatic presence in Afghanistan, then that interaction would take away some of the controversies, some of the politicization of humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. Because right now, when I sit here and look at the UN, I see that the humanitarian aid has become part of its political engagement in Afghanistan rather than its impartial input to meet a need in this country.
Lastly, again, we're speaking near the anniversary of the fall of Kabul to the Taliban. In the coming, days or weeks or months, are there any changes that you foresee that might impact your ability as an NGO leader to do your work? Or do you think where you can expect more of the same in terms of like incremental progress, as I hear you describe it?
My friends and peers here with me in Kabul, we reflected quite a lot around the time that we celebrated. Not only we got a holiday for the start of the Emirate and fall of Republic, then the departure of NATO and so on, but we also 4 days later celebrated our Independence Day from the Brits that we obtained about 105 years ago. Now, there's a lot of discussions around what it means to be free, to be independent in Afghanistan. So, what I can predict is not the question I can answer because I feel that nothing dramatic would change. We would continue to work, we would continue to push for gradual change, for understanding. I hope that the schools will open for girls. But there are a few things that in the conversations that I had was quite strong, and I carry that with me. And that is around whether we want another invasion of Afghanistan, whether we want foreign invasion, whether we want more violence, whether we want foreign proxy wars in my country. And that I can tell you nobody wants in Afghanistan. Everybody wants a peaceful solution to all the disagreements, all the differences. And I think that's what a peace building organization should invest in, and we do. That's what everybody that wants to be part of a sustainable change should invest their time in. And looking forward, I also want to continue my work and focus on a nonviolent solution to all of our problems. And I want Afghan solutions to Afghan problems. And I hope with all my heart that this would not involve another war.
Zuhra, thank you as always for your time and your perspective.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.